Hi, everyone. We're so glad to have you here today with us. My name is Bara Vaida. I am the Director of Training at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. I'm so pleased the Institute is hosting today's very timely program covering a government shutdown, story ideas for national and local reporters. Thank you for making the time to be with us. Before we get started, a few notes for the audience. We have a live transcription option, which is available to you at any time during this program. The instructions are in the chat. We'll also be recording this program, and the link to the video will be emailed to you. So if you missed something, don't worry, you'll have a chance to catch it a second time. We will also email you links to many of the resources that we'll be talking about in today's webinar. We welcome you to join us for this 45-minute conversation by putting comments and questions in the chat. So please feel free to open that now to follow along. We'll monitor the questions in the chat and we'll leave about 15 minutes to answer them. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Shai Akabas. He is the Executive Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Program. And Shai has had a long and substantive career working on federal budget issues, including with Jerome Powell, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve. In the interest of time, I won't read his full bio, but you can find out more about him on our website. Shai and I are going to have about a 30-minute conversation about where we are right now and what kind of story angles both national and local reporters can pursue in covering the story, this unfolding story. And as I said, we'll open it up for about 15 minutes of questions after our conversation. So please put your questions in the chat. We want this to be interactive. This is one of many webinars that we're doing to help you with your reporting and to help members of the public understand a topic. So welcome, Shai. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I want to start with the big question, which is, where are we right now with the story? What should reporters be watching for in these next couple of days?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Baran, to the Journalism Institute for having me here today. It's great to be with you. That question is really changing by the minute. So the activities on Capitol Hill are fast and furious. Ultimately, I'm not sure it's really changing the fundamental nature of the situation all that much, but there's rules committee hearings going on. There are bills that are being brought to the floor for votes. But taking a step back, the bigger picture is, of course, that the Senate has bipartisan agreement on how they would like to move forward with the continuing resolution. And there are some pieces that are still in question as to aid to Ukraine and disaster relief and maybe something on the border. But they've been working in a bipartisan fashion all year on appropriations bills led by Senator Patty Murray, who is the Democrat from Washington, who is the chair of the Appropriations Committee, and Senator Susan Collins from Maine, Republican, who is the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. And they have gotten all their appropriations bills out of committee. They have not yet passed them on the Senate floor. That is a tough task to do on time because of how long it takes things to go through the Senate floor. But there's now agreement that in the meantime, they should pass a continuing resolution at the levels that were agreed to with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was the debt limit deal passed earlier this year, and that they would then move forward with marking up the bills. The problem is the House, in particular House Republicans, do not agree with that plan. And some of them are still calling for even lower levels than what was negotiated in the debt limit deal. And they are trying to pass something out of the House that would enact that short-term funding at lower levels. But some of their fiercest conservatives don't even want to support any continuing resolution. They will only support appropriations bills at even lower levels, which have no chance of passing the Senate. So basically, the House and the Senate are at loggerheads right now. They're trying to figure out if there's some way to thread the needle. It looks quite unlikely that that's going to happen in the next 36 hours. This is really Washington sausage making at its worst. There's a overwhelming agreement amongst most members of the direction that this needs to go in, but there are some members that are standing in the way of that bipartisan agreement, and there's no real clear path on the way it moves from here. So ultimately, I think we are likely to enter a shutdown this weekend. And when they come back next week, we'll have to see if any of the positions have changed and how that dynamic evolves over time. We've seen from prior shutdowns that the pressure starts to build increasingly as certain services erode or turn off entirely. And I would expect that to happen this time if we enter a shutdown. What that means in terms of the exact political dynamics, we'll have to see in the coming days. But there are some folks saying that we could be shut down for quite some time. The last shutdown in 2018-19 under the Trump administration lasted 34 days. That was the longest shutdown in modern history. We've also had shutdowns that only lasted 24, 48 hours. And we could see a shorter one if they can reach agreement on some short-term patch. But even if they do reach agreement on a short-term patch, it could mean that we're sort of cycling through the fall season where there's a week or a month, and then we do this again, and we come back and repeat, rinse, wash, and repeat that process until there's some longer-term agreement. So unfortunately, things are not looking particularly optimistic right now. And that means that we will likely see some of these effects start next week. So that's where I'd start in terms of where the political dynamics are and where it looks like we're headed.
Okay, well, thanks for that kind of snapshot of where we are right this moment. If we could just step back a little bit and go to the kind of a big picture question, which is, how did we get here? Why are we heading for this shutdown? I mean, I know this is a very complicated question, but just really briefly, kind of like, so how does the budget process work? And then how do we end up right here, right now?
My short answer would be that the budget process does not work. And that is why we are where we are right now. The budget process has been fundamentally broken for many years. There are a lot of factors playing into this. Political polarization is a very important one. What we have found, the situation we found ourselves in is budgeting by crisis. We are lurching from one crisis to another. And that's not even really budgeting. That is trying to make a gasping attempt at governing. And that's really harmful to our budget and to our economic growth and our strength as a country. What it means is that most fundamentally, we are not prioritizing fiscal responsibility. So we're not finding any way to deal with the unsustainable debt burden that we have as a country. And rather than having that conversation, we are having conversations around whether or not we're going to even pay all the bills that we owe. That's the conversation we often have around the debt limit, where we have spending that we've committed to. And then the question is whether we're going to be able to issue debt to raise the cash to pay those bills. That has happened year after year after year. And then this conversation is what our priorities are going to be for the next year. And whether they're going to be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, exactly how those are going to be oriented. But when it comes to thinking about the bigger picture, the longer term question, none of that is entering the discussion, because it's all about, are we even going to have an open government next week? And what does that mean? And are agencies preparing for a shutdown? And what you all are covering, because it's the most important story right now, is how are Americans going to feel this shutdown? So it's all of these questions about how is the dysfunction going to affect the American people, rather than how should we be budgeting and what's a better process to do that. So I know it's not the main topic of today, but we at BPC have several pieces of legislation that we've been working with members of Congress on that would try to get us out of this cycle of budgeting by crisis, and happy to discuss those more with folks who are interested. But I think that is the first step that we need to take to get back on a more sustainable path towards a budget process that works and a sustainable fiscal path in the longer run.
So let's get to kind of the question of what's at stake here, right? So, and what does this mean? Just really big picture, how much is this going to affect the economy?
One thing that's really important for people to understand when we talk about a government shutdown is the portion of the budget we're talking about. I think we have a slide that tries to show this, but there's a fundamental misunderstanding among the American public of what is actually stopping when there's a government shutdown. What we're dealing with here in this debate is just the annually appropriated programs. So those are the government agencies that get funding each year, the Defense Department, and then or defense spending, which is mostly through the Defense Department, and then all the domestic agencies, what's called domestic discretionary spending. And what you see on this pie chart, which is broken up into the various pieces of government spending. So the discretionary portions that I was just referencing are in gray. I apologize, I should have made this a little bit clearer for folks, but in the gray, the sort of the upper right-hand quadrant of the chart there. So you see that is close to a third of all government spending. The bottom half almost is the major entitlement programs, Social Security there in blue, and the major healthcare programs there in red. Those are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Those are not dealt with in the annual process. And then you have some what are called other mandatory spending programs that are in the blue there. Those are like food stamps, other things along those lines, and other spending in the orange category, and then interest payments, which is in the gray. I apologize here. I should have done a better job of labeling this graph. But basically what you see here is that about a third of all government spending is in the discretionary category. But what's even more important than that is when we're talking about a shutdown, we're not even dealing with the full third that is in the discretionary spending category. We're dealing with only the services that stop when the government shuts down. And what's exempted from that are employees that are essential for either sort of the national security of the country, for protecting life and property, which it turns out is a lot of government functions, because a lot of what government does is really important to our society. So you think of basically the whole Department of Defense that is considered accepted or essential. And so effectively all Department of Defense employees continue to work. Air traffic controllers who are on the job and responsible for ensuring flight safety, they continue to work. You go through agency by agency, and a significant portion of most of these agencies will actually be working without pay, and that's important. They will get paid when the shutdown resolves, but not while the shutdown is ongoing. But they will be working without pay during this period. But roughly, we think about 2/3 of government employees, civilian employees, not excluding the military, will be staying on the job. And so we're really talking about what's shutting down here. It's maybe, a third of that third, give or take, of the budget. So we're talking about maybe 10% of all federal spending that is actually being shut down per se. And that's a lot of important functions, and we can get into what impact that's going to have. We can get into the inefficiency and the cost and the recklessness that this imposes. But we're not really talking about a full shutdown of the federal government, which would be pretty crazy to think about. I mean, if we sent, for example, even just all air traffic controllers home, and there was no ability for anybody around the country to travel anywhere, that would get this problem fixed pretty quickly, but it would be much more disruptive to our everyday life than what we see in a shutdown, which is a sort of erosion of more fundamental government services, but many of the lights are still on, and the programs that are in the mandatory category continue by and large to be paid out. So that's sort of big picture what we're seeing here. In terms of the economic cost, I think we expect this to be somewhat costly from an economic perspective, in the likely, if it drags on for several weeks, in the billions of dollars, which is not to be taken lightly and is a cost for taxpayers. But I think the bigger impact is really when you think about either more acute effects that are felt by individuals, businesses, communities on the ground, and we can get into that more, and also just the inefficiency that this poses for the federal government and the erosion of government services and initiatives that the government is trying to take on. And we can get into a variety of examples where that comes in. But for example, much of the IRS would be 2/3 of IRS employees would be sent home during the government shutdown. And that means that a lot of taxpayers are going to have trouble getting answers to their questions. You think especially about places where there have been natural disasters over the course of the last year that have gotten extensions to their tax filing. And they are basically in the middle of tax filing season now. Many of them have October 15th, I believe it is, or mid-October as their new deadline. And in the run up to that, if they're unable to get their questions answered, that could pose a real challenge. They'll also stop auditing, for example, which is not obviously a good thing for the government to do, is to stop going after taxpayers who are not making good on their money. Obviously, there will be people who will shout for joy that they don't have any chance of being audited now. But what we're dealing with, we have a huge tax gap in this country of hundreds of billions of dollars that are not being collected by people who, in some cases, are just not aware that they need to be paying taxes. But in many cases, are people that are paying taxes improperly. And the way you stop that is by having some people who are enforcing it. When the enforcers go off the job, that kind of thing is going to increase. So there's a lot of more acute impacts like that. And you could see this being felt in communities where federal employees who are across the country are getting sent.
I'm going to interrupt you right here, Shai, just because we have a chart that we created just so that people could see in their communities a list of where federal employees are working. We'll share that. Right. So for those of you who want to look at ways to localize this, take a look at how many employees there are in their state. You might not realize it. There's a tendency to think, right, all the employees are here in DC. And so if you could talk some more about that, what might happen to employees in Georgia or Ohio, restaurants, right? What happens with tourism, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for raising
Yeah.
that bar. So
Yeah.
what you see here is the point, exactly the point I was going to make, which is that
Yeah.
these employees are located around the country. And what this could mean is that communities who are impacted by the shutdown could really bear the brunt of this. So in places where there are national parks and both the employees are potentially not getting paid if they are, or they will not be getting paid if the shutdown drags on. And one important note there is I believe that most federal employees get their paycheck for the last 2 weeks next Friday on October
4th, I think.
4th.
Yeah.
And then they would be getting paid for the next 2 weeks on October 18th. So it may be that they personally and then the economy, around them does not feel that effect more broadly until we get to that mid-October timeframe. But they could also cut back on spending in advance if they think that that's coming and they're living paycheck to paycheck. So we could see these effects start to materialize earlier, but certainly if we get past the point where people are not receiving their biweekly paycheck, that will pose a significant challenge for a lot of these communities that have a heavy amount of government employees. Think both national parks, but also military bases, VA
We could put
hospitals.
that up too. We've got the federal, I was thinking military personnel too. We have that by state as well.
Yeah.
So if we could talk about that as well, the military
Yeah,
effect.
absolutely. And so, yes, military personnel would not be paid currently unless there's some specific legislation passed to pay them during this situation. And that poses a lot of hardship for military and civilian employee families. And that's not to be overlooked. During the last extended shutdown, we saw food banks being, having heavy take-up rates, and a lot of people across this country live paycheck to paycheck. And when you miss a paycheck or two, that can really hurt. The other thing to consider here is that if this really does drag on and people are not receiving paychecks, there's going to be more people who are calling in sick. And when you think about essential government functions that are not accepted, the people who are expected to be continuing to come in, you think about Border Patrol agents, you think about TSA, air traffic controllers, they're working with bare bones staff because they've cut down to that bare bones. And if people then start to call in sick and there aren't enough employees to fulfill those vital functions, that could pose real problems. And we saw that in the last shutdown where a number of TSA agents started calling in sick after more than a month of not getting paid. And that meant that certain air routes had to be shut down or delayed extensively. And that makes this hit home more for the American public. So those are the ways I think that we're going to start feeling this over time in a more acute way beyond federal employees not receiving their salaries. And there's lots of other examples of that, but Bar, I'll stop there as sort of a way that this will likely impact communities across the country.
Well, just to kind of get into a little bit more specifics in terms of, people who rely on government services, what does this mean for people who are getting Social Security checks?
So interestingly, Social Security, I think, is one of the places that will have less disruption than others. The majority of employees at the Social Security Administration who work on the front lines will be staying on, and administration of those benefits, which are a mandatory program, is considered an exception to the shutdown, basically. And so the employees that are in the field offices, by and large, will continue to come in. There may be a little bit of short staff, so it may be a little bit more difficult if you're applying for benefits and everything that goes along with that. But people can expect to continue receiving their benefits. That has happened in prior shutdowns. But you certainly could see lots of other services that the government provides that fall in the discretionary category have disruptions. So loans that are made by the Small Business Administration, those may slow or stop, and that can be a really big problem if this extends for a period of time for small businesses that are relying on those programs. Farm support programs that go out to small farmers across the country, the administration of those could slow down or come to a halt, and people who are relying on those may not be able to receive them.
What about food stamps, things like that? Community health. Yeah.
And the WIC program, the Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, as the full name is, both of those I think fall in the category of programs that for the moment, if it's a short shutdown, will likely continue to pay out benefits as normal. But what we've seen in past shutdowns is there have been warnings that if those shutdowns continue for an extended period of time, the leftover funds that they have to administer and provide benefits to those programs end up running dry. And so there is a real danger that if this goes on for more than a few weeks, that we could see disruptions to those programs as well, which are obviously dealing with very vulnerable populations. So you certainly could see disruptions to government programs like that. Head Start centers, I think they will be operating at lower staff. And so it could be that new students are not being admitted. There could be disruptions in a variety of those types of programs. It's often difficult to figure out exactly what functions will continue, which ones will be moderately disrupted, and which ones will come to a grinding halt. Every agency releases a shutdown plan, but sometimes they get a little bit more granular than others. Other times they, sort of imply that activities will continue, but maybe at a slower pace or at a reduced scale. And so trying to interpret exactly what this means can be challenging. But I do think it's safe to say that a lot of these programs will have impacts on people across the country that are interacting with them. So I think it is less likely that we'll see a really big macroeconomic impact here, but more likely that people who are trying to deal with, whether it's the IRS or whether it's applying for benefits in some of these programs, will be feeling the pain that is unexpected and really should not be present when for a functioning government.
And reporters who wanted to drill down on some of this can find some answers in looking at the contingency plans of the White House, I believe, has been posting for each agency. Is that a good place to look to find out how this may affect your specific community?
Yes, those are great places to look. If you have trouble finding those, please feel free to share my contact information after, and I'm happy to provide those. We also at the Bipartisan Policy Center have a variety of experts in a number of different policy programs, whether it's energy, education, health, et cetera. And so please, folks should feel free to reach out to me or to our press team at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and happy to try to refer you to people who have more granular expertise in a particular agency or particular set of programs that might be of interest to your region or the stories that you're covering.
What about student loans? I know that that was supposed to beginning October 1st, a payment on student loans. What's going to happen with that?
Yeah, great question on student loans. So a couple points to make here. The first is that when it comes to student loans in general, those will still be owed. So people should not be under the misimpression that just because the government shut down means that you don't have to pay your student loan. In fact, if you don't start making your payments, that just means that your interest on the balance that you owe will continue to rise. And you could ultimately be found in delinquency if you are not making payments month after month. What I think the real problem is here for borrowers is that there have been so many points of confusion around the changes that are going on in the student loan system. There was the pause, and that's being ended, and then there was the forgiveness that was then overturned, and then there's the new repayment plan that has just gone into effect, and it's partially in effect, and it's getting fully rolled out next year. So a lot of students now have new servicers that they didn't have before the pandemic pause. And so there's so many different things that are going on with the student loan system, partially that have been driven by this administration, partially that have been driven by COVID, that a lot of students' heads are spinning, and borrowers, I should say, heads are spinning, and they don't know how to proceed here. I believe most of them will still be able to get assistance in a way that probably exceeds what the IRS that I mentioned earlier is providing. But certainly if students are trying to get answers, that may be harder than it normally is. Students who are trying to apply for public service loan forgiveness, I think that may be stalled or delayed in this period, which means they either they may run into trouble in terms of how their loans are being processed, and it may be deemed that they still owe money that they may not have owed if they were confirmed for that program. People trying to consolidate their loans may run into trouble if the Department of Education is short-staffed in that space. So I think there will be some smaller acute challenges there, maybe some problems with the customer service element, but more broadly, this is just throwing an added wrench into what borrowers are already facing in terms of trying to figure out how they should be handling the restart of payments and trying to get their arms around what they owe with student loans. And then the final point I would make is sort of from a macroeconomic standpoint. Chairman Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve has emphasized that student loan piece, the start of repayment, as well as the government shutdown, are two of several factors that they believe could put a thorn in the side of the recovery that's going on right now, or the steady economic growth that we have, that could send us back towards slower growth or a downturn. And so there's a combination of factors here: student loans, the shutdown, higher interest rates, other things that are factoring into something that could generate collectively an economic slowdown. Again, I don't think this is going to drive us into an economic crisis, the shutdown. We've been here before. We've seen what this looks like, but it could factor in, along with student loan, the resumption of repayments, to household finances that look shakier than they just did a few months ago, and to more sort of medium-term economic problems.
And you said earlier, it's really hard to kind of quantify exactly how many services are going to be disrupted here, but we know for sure it's going to disrupt things in different ways, in many ways unseen, kind of the behind the scenes plumbing. I think you've used that kind of term. Can you talk more about how we can help journalists just make this more tangible for their communities?
Yeah, it is very difficult to describe the biggest problems that are associated with shutdowns like this, because most of those effects, perhaps the most damaging of those effects, except for the ones that are very acute and individual based, or federal employees, for example, not being paid, are happening behind the scenes. So one example is NOAA will stop its reconnaissance planes. I'm not sure I'm using the technical term there, but the flights that they do to give them information about whether emerging hurricanes and other weather events like that provide vital data to give warning to communities that are going to be experiencing those. So we've seen a lot of significant hurricanes already this season, and there could be more that could pose a real problem. We see other problems with the gears of government. So, for example, the Department of Defense cannot engage in new contracts during this period. And so that could have problems for national security down the road if this drags on for a month or more. If it's a couple of days, sure, they can wait to sign the contract. But the Secretary Buttigieg in the Department of Transportation has been emphasizing that, yes, current air traffic controllers will stay on duty, but the training for new air traffic controllers will stop. This is a particularly bad time for that to happen because we're already short air traffic controllers. We've seen delays that have stemmed from that. And if the pipeline gets further delayed for new controllers to come online, that could lead to more flight delays in weeks or months or even years from now. That's not something that is really easy to connect to communities on the ground and to help people understand how it's a one-for-one correlation. But those are just a few examples of how we see the effects here impacting communities, but in sort of unseen ways. And I think that is the larger impact of this shutdown. There will certainly be cases where people can't get their benefits, or they're having trouble getting customer service at the IRS, things like that, which I think are going to be the most attractive to report on in the near term. But it's this erosion in the gears of government and in vital services that government provides. Rail safety inspectors, most of those are going to be sent home. So if you think about what happened in Ohio earlier this year, the exact people that are on the job there and that we want to make sure these incidents are not happening again, that we want to be present, are not going to be on the job. And so that makes incidents like that at least modestly more likely. You think about a lot of those functions, that is what is getting eroded here.
The train, as I was speaking about what happened.
Sorry, the train derailment, exactly.
Yeah. What about what happens to government contractors? There's there is a large number of services that are provided by contractors that wouldn't specifically be affected by this per se, but could you talk more about that?
Yes, contractors are obviously used extensively across the federal government, and they, by and large, the employees of those contractors, most of them will continue to be paid, especially at larger contractors, I would think, on the assumption that those contracts will continue once the government reopens. But certainly for smaller businesses, the government contracts with a lot of small businesses as well. And for those employers, this could, both for the owners of those businesses as well as for the employees of those businesses, cause real hardship. And it'll be a case-by-case basis. There's no guarantee of their funding. And if the business cannot afford to continue sending out paychecks when they're not receiving payments from the federal government, then they won't. So that could have an impact on individual households, on businesses, and then on communities across the country.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for all that. We want to open this up to questions. So please dive in with asking Shai questions here. One we got here, and it's related to something we were talking about earlier about the contingency planning. Is there a way to find kind of local contingency planning or who to contact, where to reach out to find out what federal agency is working in states and local levels, what might be happening there?
That's a great question. I don't know, for example, with national parks, I think they've said that most parks are going to be closed, how to confirm that. I would guess that at some point in the coming days, they will put out a comprehensive list from the Department of Interior, I believe is what oversees national parks, of which parks are closed and which ones remain open. The agencies themselves tend to be the best places for that. Obviously, the agencies themselves are also working on thin staff, so it may be more difficult to get in touch with them than normal. I don't know that there's necessarily a local place to get all of that information. It may be possible to get in touch with some of the state or local agencies that help administer some of those benefits and hear from them what is still coming through and what is not coming through and what their expectations are. I don't think there is really a one-stop shop that I've seen of those impacts on the ground at a local level.
Okay. What about how is this debate different from the debt ceiling? I mean, we heard about catastrophe earlier this year, then it got resolved. And now we're talking catastrophe again, economic catastrophe again. How is this different from that? And why does, again, you addressed this a little bit, but why is this happening again in this moment?
Yeah, it's really important to help Americans understand the difference between this and the debt limit situation. They are both very important, and they're both emblematic of the dysfunction that we have in the federal budgeting process and in our federal government, but they're very different. So for a shutdown, we've been there before, we've seen that, we generally know what it looks like. No two shutdowns are exactly the same, and some agencies are impacted, and some of them, all agencies are impacted, and some of them they're shorter, and some of them they're longer, and some of them they happen at the beginning of the fiscal year, which is right now, and some of them they happen at different times. But we generally know what the impact is going to be. When it comes to, and it's not going to be catastrophic, it's going to be disruptive and harmful to certainly many households and businesses across the country, but not catastrophic. When it comes to the debt limit, what we are dealing with there is risks and costs that build up to what we call the X date, which is when the government might actually default on some of its obligations. And that's where this is different, is that the government shutdown is because the government has not decided what to spend money on next year. The debt limit is a situation where we have decided to spend money. We have decided on entitlement programs and even the annually appropriated programs, but we don't actually have cash to pay all of our bills, which is a huge problem. You think about, as a household, not having the cash to pay all of your bills. So in that sense, we don't know what the impacts of defaulting on government obligations would be, because we've never been there before as a country. We've never failed in some holistic way to meet those commitments, and we are considered the gold standard around the world of trustworthiness and credit. So when it comes to that question, reaching that threshold could be a much more again, using the word catastrophic, global event than just a government shutdown is. But it's worth noting that just last week, Moody's, the credit rating agency, warned that they might downgrade U.S. debt if we enter a government shutdown, I think mostly because of just the general government dysfunction that we're experiencing, which we spent a lot of time today talking about. We've already seen downgrades from S&P and Fitch, which are the other two major credit rating agencies. I don't expect the downgrade from Moody's to dramatically change either the political situation or the economic situation, but it is certainly reflective of the fact that there is a reduced faith in the ability of the federal government to carry out the most basic functions like funding. And that should be concerning to both policymakers and Americans across the country.
Right. So here's a question about are FOIA and open records officers exempted as essential employees, right? As journalists, we rely on the FOIA process for part of our reporting, wondering how we'll be able to get reliable, timely information during a shutdown.
I believe I saw something that said that the FOIA process will be interrupted by the shutdown. That would be my guess in terms of whether it's considered an essential service or a non-essential service, but I can try to get back to, if we know who had that question, I'm happy to try to get back to them afterwards on that. I don't, what's interesting is that would likely be agency by agency. There might be a directive across the administration as to how to handle that, but obviously each of these agencies carries out FOIA requests internally itself. And so it's possible that there is some, divergence in terms of how each agency is handling that and in terms of which staff is kept on. And I should note that that is another thing that makes each shutdown different, is that the administration is trying to abide by both the Anti-Deficiency Act, which requires that the administration not spend money that it is not allocated or appropriated by Congress, but at the same time that there are exceptions for life, property, et cetera, as we were defining earlier. And there's a lot of gray area in there. Some of the gray area has been a little better defined over the years because this has been in effect for a very long time. And we've seen, well over a dozen government shutdowns in the past, but much of it remains gray area. And so there have actually been differences by administration, when the Obama administration, Trump administration, now the Biden administration, in terms of what services are continued during a government shutdown. And so again, that doesn't get to the specific answer to the FOIA question, but it does help explain that each administration handles this in a slightly different way.
Goes to some of the unseen consequences, ripple effects that we're talking about. Another question we had is, are federal employees affected by the shutdown? Are they allowed to talk to the media about the situation? And how can we encourage them to discuss the impact from their point of view?
That's a good question. I don't know what federal employees whether a career federal employee is generally allowed to talk to the media. I would guess that it is against the policy of most agencies, but I don't know that for a fact because most of them have spokespeople that are supposed to do that on behalf of the agency. I'm not sure that would necessarily change significantly in the context of a shutdown. I would imagine that there's no directive going out saying, yes, you're allowed to talk about all this other stuff, but you're not allowed to talk about the shutdown. But some folks on the call may know better than I do whether federal employees are normally allowed to speak to those questions. And I would guess that the same policy largely applies when it comes to the situation here.
Although it's interesting, right? Because they're furloughed, right? But they're not technically, being paid and they're not working. So
that's true. I would guess that there would be a willingness among some federal employees to speak on background, if not on the record, if you find certain government employees. But my guess is also that the policy is generally that they're not supposed to do it, certainly not with name and title.
But I think that's a great way to illustrate how this everything that is happening is really affecting people's lives, families, communities, and that these employees should be able to speak to the media. It's really important to illustrate how this really matters. Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah. Again, because a shutdown boils down to political differences in the system itself. How can journalists specifically help battle misinformation or misunderstanding about shutdowns within their communities?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I'm sure some folks on the call have good thoughts on this as well. From my vantage point, I think helping to explain some of the fundamentals here that we've been talking about on the call in terms of what is getting shut down and what is not, why we are generally in this situation, budget dysfunction. I do think, I'm not going to categorize the political situation, and we'll let reporters do that for themselves. But we at the Bipartisan Policy Center feel very strongly that there needs to be a bipartisan solution to this problem. And so partisan bills that are being sent through for messaging purposes are not getting us all that much closer to an eventual agreement. There are very complicated dynamics going on, particularly within the House Republican conference right now, between more moderate members that want to pursue a deal with Democrats, perhaps negotiating some of the details, but ultimately get to a compromise and really avoid a shutdown. And then there are others that seem to, regardless of what the concessions are or what the policy details are looking effectively to shut the government down, and are saying that the consequences wouldn't be that bad. So I think that based on what the parties are saying, it's relatively clear where they stand on this issue. And some of them feel that a shutdown may be worth it for the broader issues that they're fighting for. I'll note, though, that if you look back at past shutdowns, it's very rare that there are significant concessions adopted in terms of spending restraint or fixing our broader budget challenges as a result of a shutdown. Certainly not in the bigger picture of the federal budget. We've seen a little bit of shaving here, a side deal here, whatever, to get the government back open. Sure, but most of the time, this is something that could have been agreed to before the shutdown began. And instead, we have to go through the process of shutting down the government and reopening it in order to get that deal, because it's what adds the political pressure. And I would also finally note that this whole process is helping the American people understand that this whole process is wildly inefficient for American taxpayers and the government. So we're basically having federal employees spend time shutting down the federal government. It takes them time to turn off the systems, lock the doors, et cetera, et cetera. And then during the period that the government shut down, we are still paying all federal employees. We're just telling about a third of them to stay home and not do their jobs. And that is both a waste of government resources, but also impacting people who are expecting to be relying on those resources. So for example, people trying to get their questions answered by the IRS. Not only can't they get their questions answered, but we're still paying the people who can't answer their questions. So it's sort of adding insult to injury in a number of ways and helping people understand that this is it's really all for nothing. And it's great to fight the good fight and have policy priorities and try to negotiate concessions and find a place that the two parties can agree to. But shutdowns are really the most inefficient way to do that. And there are a number of members that are pushing on a bipartisan basis. So for example, in the Senate, Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma and Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire, former as a Republican, latter as a Democrat, have been advancing the Prevent Government Shutdowns Act, which would basically be a permanent solution that would avoid this situation in the future when there's a lapse in appropriations. It would provide for an automatic continuing resolution, which basically continues the prior spending levels until there can be an agreement by Congress as to how to move forward. And there would be certain incentives put in place to try to not just live with that continuing resolution for a long period of time, but force them into agreement. So something like that, I think it would would help us end this recurring crisis and at least get us away from the most inefficient of outcomes, which is a government shutdown.
And we just have a few more minutes left here, but there's a really good question, which I think you might be able to answer this, Shai. Has anyone done the math on this? Those pushing for a government shutdown want to save an X amount, just sort of going to the point that you've just been talking about. The shutdown itself will cost Y amount per day. Is anyone doing the math on how many days a shutdown would be in terms of kind of how much it's costing by day? I know this is a little bit hard to quantify, but what have you guys kind of generally assessed?
Yeah, so the last government shutdown, I believe, was projected to cost about $12 billion. Let me just confirm that I've got this right. In that quarter that it happened. And then much of that economic activity, $12 billion, I believe it was. And then much of that economic activity is made up over time. So for example, when federal employees then get paid or when services get turned back on, you sort of make up some of the lost ground. So the net cost was about $3 billion, which again is significant. It's not going to be on quite the same order of magnitude that are some of the cuts that some of the more conservative members are calling for. I don't think they're going to get those cuts, but in apples to apples, I think it's a little tough to put it in those terms, but I do think it is helpful for people to appreciate that even in the scheme of the full federal budget, our debt problem, we have a roughly, our debt is, I forget the exact number that we're at right now, but in roughly $25 trillion of debt held by the public, maybe even a little bit more. And we're talking about saving, perhaps tens of billions of dollars here in next year's appropriations at best. And our annual deficit is, if you take out some funky calculations, is running at roughly $2 trillion a year. So, saving a few $10 billion here or there. Yes, it's important. And yes, it is more than the $3 billion that the 1 month shutdown cost the last time around. And this one could be a little bit more because it's the full government instead of just some government agencies. But again, I think that the underlying point here is that this is pure waste. This is not, so if we waste $3 billion here and save $4 billion there, the $4 billion is actually services that the American people will not receive. The $3 billion was just wasted money. And so, was the cumulative effect of those two worth the $4 billion of savings? Probably not. And I think we need to help people understand that it's not really spend a penny here, save a penny there. It's really lots of taxpayer waste that is going for minimal amounts of savings in terms of reductions to the federal budget.
Right. So we have some more really specific questions, which I know that you have folks at regarding very specific projects. And I know that the Bipartisan Policy Center has experts that could answer these. So the folks there who asked those questions, we're just getting kind of to our final minutes here. So I'm going to recommend that you reach out to me or reach out to Shai, and we'll help you find the right folks to talk to. I'd just like to circle back to the timing. I know you said at the beginning, we can't say exactly how long the shutdown's going to last. I know yesterday there were some thoughts that because everyone doesn't want the shutdown to happen, then they're going to try and wrap this up, sooner rather than later. It's obvious. A lot of folks, most folks want that, but what do you think, given what's the dynamics that we're seeing in the House right now today? What's right now the guess how long this is going to be, which we watch for as journalists?
Yeah, it's really difficult to use the crystal ball because the dynamic does fluctuate on a daily basis. And so the pressure that comes from the actual shutdown is, again, often what leads the two parties towards a deal that they could have reached before, but the nature of the politics prevents that. Another thing that's important to recognize is the dysfunction that we have is reflected in the fact also that the vast majority of members of Congress do not want to shut down and are trying to work towards avoiding one. But there are some members who are okay with a shutdown and who are calling for very aggressive demands in exchange for not having one. And so, I think that is reflective of the problems that we have within our governing system right now, that a small minority can basically prevent us from reaching a deal that the two parties negotiated together earlier in the year around the debt limit, which was supposed to avoid this very situation. And so I don't know exactly how this is going to play out. I don't think anybody does, but we'll need to see how the shutdown itself continues. And that usually is what puts pressure on the politicians. I'll note that one irony here is because so much of the government continues to function, the pressure on lawmakers and the impact that's felt around the country is less than it otherwise would be. So because a lot of these functions are exempted, my favorite example is just air traffic controllers. If they shut down the flights around the country, I bet you that the pressure would be great enough that maybe this doesn't even happen in the first place. But I can't imagine that it would go on for more than a few days because people would just be absolutely incensed and calling their lawmakers every day saying this is absolutely ridiculous. And so because we don't have quite that level of disruption, it makes it more challenging, not less challenging, for policymakers to resolve.
All right. Well, thank you. We're just about out of time here. I really appreciate your time with us today, Shai, and I know that you'll be there as a resource as this story continues to unfold. This has been a great 45 minutes of advice and resources, so we really appreciate it. To our program participants, if you found this program helpful to your work, we hope you'll make a donation in any amount today to support free programs like today's. Every dollar helps us produce programs for you at no cost and for other journalists. So we'll drop a link in the chat for that. And I want to thank you all for being here today, for all your great questions. We'll send a follow-up email with a video recording, as well as links to resources to Shai's info. And we want to just give a big thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center and Shai for providing the expertise today to help journalists covering the story. Stay well. We wish you well in your reporting. Please join us next week. We'll be doing another training next Wednesday, uncovering fall health care topics, which we'll include in our follow-up email to everyone. So Shai, thank you again so very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Bara. It's great to be here.